The Los Angeles Chargers' 20-16 loss to the Houston Texans in Week 17 was not the result of a single failure, but rather the predictable outcome of a structural mismatch that compounded over 4 quarters. The Chargers produced 275 total yards on 59 offensive plays, averaging 4.7 yards per play, yet finished with a negative EPA per play and only 16 points. Houston, by contrast, generated just 362 total yards, but scored efficiently through explosive passing plays, avoided drive-killing negative outcomes, and consistently won the field position battle. The difference was not raw production, but how each team converted leverage into points. The game was effectively shaped in the first quarter, when Houston scored 2 touchdowns on explosive passes of 75 yards and 43 yards. Those 2 plays accounted for nearly half of the Texans' passing yardage and immediately forced the Chargers into a pass-heavy script. From that moment forward, Los Angeles was operating from behind, which exposed the most fragile parts of its offensive identity. Houston did not need sustained drives or red zone volume. Those early explosive plays created a margin that allowed the Texans to play patiently, trade field position, and force the Chargers to execute flawlessly in high-difficulty situations. Offensively, the Chargers' central problem was early down leverage erosion. On first down across the game, Los Angeles posted a negative EPA per play, meaning drives routinely began behind schedule. This was especially true in first and medium situations, defined as 3 to 6 yards to go, where both the run and pass were structurally losing. The Chargers' run game failed to generate push in these moments, producing minimal yards before contact and frequently setting up second and long scenarios. When Los Angeles attempted to compensate with play action, the Texans' defense did not bite. Linebackers stayed disciplined, safeties did not rotate aggressively, and the pocket still collapsed. As a result, first down play action did not meaningfully improve efficiency or reduce pressure. Second down was where the Chargers' offense collapsed outright. In Week 17, Los Angeles posted its worst EPA per play on second down, averaging barely over 1 yard per snap. This failure was not consistent with the Chargers' season-long profile, where second and short and second and medium are normally productive states. Instead, Houston forced Los Angeles into second and medium situations, where the run game lost value and passing plays required extended time to develop. Those extended plays triggered pressure without heavy blitzing, leading to sacks, stalled drives, and lost field position. By the time the Chargers reached third down, they were already paying for the damage inflicted earlier in the series. Third down, paradoxically, was not the Chargers' problem. In fact, Los Angeles posted positive EPA on third down in Week 17, driven largely by quarterback problem-solving under pressure. Justin Herbert extended plays, converted difficult throws, and kept drives alive in situations where the offense had no structural advantage. However, this success came at a cost. Third down plays required long time to throw, pressure rates were high, and sacks were always looming. Over the course of the game, the Chargers were forced to live in these high-stress states far more often than their season baseline, and the cumulative effect eventually stalled scoring opportunities. The pass protection environment explains why those third-down heroics were unsustainable. Los Angeles allowed 5 sacks, all of which occurred on plays where the time to throw exceeded 2.5 seconds. The pressure was not driven by heavy blitzing, but by consistent losses on the offensive line, particularly at left tackle and on the right side. Houston repeatedly collapsed the pocket with 4 rushers, forcing Herbert to hold the ball or absorb sacks in high-leverage moments. Meanwhile, The Texans' offensive line allowed 0 sacks, even though quarterback C.J. Stroud also held the ball on deep and intermediate concepts. That difference alone accounted for a massive swing in EPA and field position. Houston's offensive approach was deliberately high variance but structurally sound. When Stroud held the ball longer than 2.5 seconds, the Texans produced explosive gains and touchdowns, while also throwing 2 interceptions. However, the absence of sacks meant those negative outcomes did not compound. Explosives and turnovers tend to cancel out in EPA terms, but sacks do not. Houston accepted volatility because it avoided the most damaging play type in football, while Los Angeles absorbed repeated drive-killing losses. Field position was the silent deciding factor throughout the game. Houston consistently protected field position through superior punting, pinning the Chargers deep and forcing long fields. Los Angeles, by contrast, frequently punted after sacks or negative second-down plays, resulting in Texans possessions that began in neutral or favorable territory. Even when the Chargers forced turnovers, including 2 interceptions of Stroud, they failed to convert those opportunities into touchdowns. A goal line interception, a missed field goal before halftime, and a missed extra point in the fourth quarter all compounded the problem. Each of those moments represented a significant expected point swing that never materialized on the scoreboard. Structurally, Houston's defense proved capable of winning regardless of offensive formation. Whether the Chargers operated from shotgun or under center, the Texans forced long time to throw situations, maintained disciplined run fits, and avoided overcommitting extra defenders. Under center runs were stuffed, shotgun passes were slowed, and play action failed to manipulate coverage. Houston removed leverage without relying on box count advantages, which confirms that the matchup was not about schematic choice, but about structural control. In summary, the Chargers lost because they could not create early down leverage, could not protect long enough to exploit intermediate routes, and could not convert field position into points. Houston won by striking early with explosives, avoiding sacks on offense, forcing sacks on defense, and dominating the hidden yardage battle through punting and situational discipline. The final score reflected not a narrow contest decided by luck, but a game where one team consistently avoided negative outcomes, while the other accumulated them until the margin became insurmountable. Houston's defense beat the Chargers' offense on the snap-to-snap process, and the Chargers also beat themselves in the small number of high-leverage finish moments that decide a one-score game. Houston won 20-16, and the underlying efficiency shows the Chargers' offense was operating uphill most of the day. Los Angeles finished with 275 total yards on 59 plays, 4.7 yards per play, while Houston held them to 201 net passing yards and produced 5 sacks, and the Texans' offense allowed 0 sacks. Those sacks were not empty stats either. 2 came in the first quarter and immediately reinforced that longer developing offense would be punished. Most importantly, Houston's defense made the single biggest defense did that play of the game when Azeez Al-Shaair intercepted Justin Herbert at the Houston 1-yard line late in the second quarter, wiping out a prime scoring opportunity. At the same time, the Chargers absolutely contributed to their own loss because they left points on the field in ways that are unusually avoidable for an NFL team in a 4-point game. Late in the second quarter, Cameron Dicker missed a 32-yard field goal, and in the fourth quarter, the Chargers scored a touchdown to cut the deficit to 4, but missed the extra point kick, which mattered strategically because it removed a path where a later field goal could have been enough. The Chargers also failed to fully capitalize on short fields created by their defense. Los Angeles actually won the turnover margin, Houston had 2 turnovers. Los Angeles had 1. But one interception that set the Chargers up around the Houston 37-yard line still ended in only 3 points. And another interception that set them up around the Houston 32-yard line immediately preceded the missed 32-yard field goal. So if the question is who controlled the matchup, the answer is that Houston's defense did, by limiting yards per play, generating sacks, and winning the highest leverage red zone snap with the goal line interception. If the question is, why did Los Angeles lose a game they still had chances to win? The answer is that the Chargers beat themselves at the margins, through missed kicks and failing to convert short field opportunities into touchdowns. It is possible to separate play calling from quarterback play in a disciplined way, but it is never perfectly clean because both are reacting to the same constraints: protection, receiver separation, down and distance, and game script. In practice, analysts do a partial separation by looking for signals that belong mostly to the play caller: how often the offense creates favorable situations, how often it chooses concepts that require long developing timing, how predictable the down and distance profile becomes, how the red zone plan is constructed, versus signals that belong mostly to the quarterback: accuracy on routine throws, turnover-worthy decisions, sack responsibility from holding the ball, and whether the quarterback converts the favorable looks that the play caller creates. Without tracking-based data like completion percentage over expected and pressure to sack rates, and without film to judge whether receivers were open, you cannot assign an exact percentage of blame, but you can make a strong directional judgment. Using what we do have from this game, the quarterback's baseline performance was not the primary problem. Justin Herbert finished 21 of 32 for 236 yards, with 1 touchdown and 1 interception, and the Chargers produced 275 total yards on 59 plays. That is not an elite output, but it is also not a meltdown. The biggest quarterback negative in the game was the goal line interception at the Houston 1-yard line late in the second quarter, which erased a prime scoring chance. There is also some quarterback responsibility embedded in sacks, because quarterbacks influence sacks by how long they hold the ball and how they manage the pocket. But sacks are also heavily driven by protection and play design. Herbert was sacked 5 times in a 4-point loss, and those negative plays repeatedly turned possessions into punts and long field situations. The key point is that Herbert did enough to keep the game within reach. One high-leverage mistake hurt badly, but his overall passing line does not look like the main reason the offense scored only 16. The stronger evidence points to the offensive structure, which is the combined outcome of play calling and protection, being the bigger problem. Houston held the Chargers to 4.7 yards per play and generated 5 sacks, while allowing 0 sacks on the other side, which tells you the Chargers were losing the line of scrimmage and timing battle more than they were losing an accuracy battle. When a defense can win with pressure and still keep explosive passes under control, it forces the offense into longer, harder drives where every negative play matters more. That is exactly what happened. The Chargers had multiple chances but repeatedly failed to turn opportunities into touchdowns, including the red zone turnover and later missed kicks. And they could not consistently create easy downs that keep the call sheet open. Importantly, some of the most damaging outcomes, like sacks, are often more a referendum on how the offense is being asked to win than on whether the quarterback is missing open throws. In other words, if the offense is frequently living in long developing dropbacks behind a leaking edge or stressed interior, the quarterback will eventually eat sacks no matter how well he plays. So, who was worse in this specific game? The play caller or the quarterback? If you force a binary answer, the quarterback was not the worst component. The Chargers' offense looked more like an offense that was structurally constrained and repeatedly put into high-difficulty situations than an offense that was being sabotaged by quarterback accuracy. Herbert's worst moment, the goal line interception, was extremely costly, but the larger pattern, 5 sacks, low yards per play, and difficulty finishing drives, looks more like Houston's defense consistently winning the timing and leverage fight than the quarterback consistently failing to execute. In short, Houston's defense won the matchup, and the Chargers' offensive structure made the quarterback's job harder than it needed to be. The quarterback contributed one major mistake, but the structure was the bigger drag. Yes, now that you've posted the tight window and open window receiving splits, including receiving expected points added and, for open targets, expected points added per target, we can combine those with separation to make a strong, evidence-based read on whether the Chargers' Week 17 problem was that receivers were not getting open, that play design and usage did not create open throws for the right players, or that the quarterback was forcing tight throws. Your definitions are straightforward, with a tight window defined as less than 1 yard of separation and an open window defined as 3 or more yards. In Week 17, the Chargers had 32 total targets, matching Justin Herbert's 32 pass attempts, and the distribution you provided implies 12 open targets, 2 to Will Dissly, 1 to Trey Harris, 2 to Ladd McConkey, 5 to Omarion Hampton, and 2 to Oronde Gadsden II, while only 3 targets fell into the tight window bucket, 1 each to Hampton, Keenan Allen, and Quentin Johnston. That leaves 17 of 32 targets in the middle window range between 1 and under 3 yards, which is where most NFL passing tends to live. So the mere existence of a large middle bucket is not abnormal. What matters is which players those targets went to and what the outcomes were. The performance split between open and tight targets is highly consistent. On open targets, the offense was generally productive. Dissly produced plus 1.29 expected points added per target on 2 targets. Harris produced plus 1.52 expected points added per target on 1 target. McConkey produced plus 0.58 expected points added per target on 2 targets. Hampton was essentially neutral at minus 0.01 expected points added per target on 5 targets, and Gadsden was slightly negative at minus 0.10 expected points added per target on 2 targets. Summed together, the open target group produced roughly plus 5.0 total expected points added on 12 targets, or about plus 0.42 expected points added per target overall, which is strong efficiency on throws that are clearly open by the 3 or more yards definition. Tight window targets, by contrast, produced predictably poor outcomes. Hampton's 1 tight window target carried minus 1.3 receiving expected points added. Allen's 1 tight window target was incomplete and carried minus 0.5 receiving expected points added, and Johnston's 1 tight window target was also incomplete and carried minus 0.9 receiving expected points added, for roughly minus 2.7 total expected points added on 3 tight targets, or about minus 0.9 expected points added per target. The story is therefore clean at a high level. When the Chargers threw to truly open receivers, they created good expected points added. When they threw into truly tight windows, they lost expected points added. That relationship is also the key signal for separating quarterback decision-making from structural constraints. Because the tight window volume is tiny, only 3 total targets, it strongly suggests Herbert was not spending the game forcing impossible throws. If the quarterback were the primary driver of the offense's problems through poor decisions, you would typically expect a much higher number of tight window targets and/or poor expected points added even on open window throws. Your data shows the opposite. Tight window throws were rare, and open window throws were generally efficient. That leans away from the quarterback being the main problem and toward the offense being constrained in what it could create and where it could create it. This becomes more diagnostic when you layer in the receiver separation numbers you posted. Quentin Johnston averaged 1.6 yards of separation on 8 targets, which was the highest wide receiver target volume, while Keenan Allen averaged 1.2 yards on 3 targets. Ladd McConkey averaged 3.4 yards on 2 targets. Oronda Gadsden II averaged 3.4 yards on 6 targets. Omarion Hampton averaged 4.6 yards on 8 targets. And Will Dissly averaged 9.6 yards on 2 targets. When you check those separation profiles against the open and tight window buckets, Johnston and Allen do not appear in the open 3 or more yards list at all, while each appears once in the tight window list, and most of the open targets went to tight ends and backs, with McConkey appearing in open targets only in small volume. That means the Chargers were generating clear separation primarily through backs and tight ends, not through their highest volume perimeter wide receiver usage. What that implies is that 2 things can be true at the same time. The offense did create open throws, 12 open targets with strong expected points added on many of them, which argues against the blanket claim that nobody was open all game. At the same time, the offense did not create open throws for its primary outside wide receiver volume, particularly Johnston and Allen, which points toward either a receiver limitation, where those players simply were not separating, a usage and design limitation, where the offense used too many isolation routes and not enough motion, bunch, stack, or free releases to manufacture open windows for them, or some combination of both. Because Johnston had 8 targets with low average separation and 0 open window targets, it is hard to argue that the system was regularly springing him wide open, even though he still produced yards, which suggests he was being used in roles that do not require large separation, such as in-breaking routes into zone windows, back shoulder throws, or plays that rely on ball placement rather than separation. The biggest hidden insight in your data is where the negative expected points added likely came from, because even with strong efficiency on open targets, the Chargers still did not have a strong overall passing expected points added profile in the game context you were building. The most likely explanations, using only Chargers side evidence, are that sacks and pressure outcomes were draining expected points added in ways that do not show up in receiving splits, and that the middle window targets between 1 and under 3 yards, which represent the majority of attempts, were where many of the stalled drive outcomes lived. You can see hints of this by comparing overall receiving expected points added totals to the open and tight subsets. For example, Oronda Gadsden II was very negative overall, but only slightly negative on open targets, implying the real damage came on his non-open targets. Omarion Hampton shows a similar pattern. Open targets were near neutral, but overall receiving expected points added was much worse, implying that the negative value came from other window types or usage contexts, such as low-value checkdowns, throws short of the sticks, or plays where the defense rallied immediately. Based on the combination of separation plus open and tight window expected points added, the conclusions you can state confidently are that the Chargers were capable of generating open throws, and when they did, the offense generally converted them into positive expected points added. Herbert did not appear to be forcing tight window throws at a high rate, since only 3 targets qualified as tight by your definition. And the separation problem was not uniform but concentrated, with backs and tight ends getting open more often, while the main perimeter wide receiver volume, particularly Johnston and Allen, lived in below-average separation and did not show up in open window targets. So if the question is whether receivers were consistently getting open, the honest answer is that some were, backs and tight ends. But the highest volume wide receiver targets were not consistently open by the 3 or more yards definition. If the question is whether play calling constrained separation, the distribution strongly suggests the offense did not manufacture many wide-open perimeter targets for its top wide receiver volume, which is at least partly a design and usage issue, though you cannot fully separate that from receiver talent without knowing who was open but not targeted. The one extra data layer that would make this airtight is any measure of whether an open receiver existed on a play, even if not targeted, such as an open receiver exists rate measuring the percentage of dropbacks where any receiver is open within 2.5 seconds, a first read open rate, or separation segmented by route type, alignment, and motion for Johnston and Allen specifically. Those additions would tell you whether the offense created open answers that the quarterback did not take, which would be more about quarterback processing and choices, or whether open answers often did not exist for the primary wide receiver concepts, which would be more about play design and receiver limitation. This receiver motion receiving split is very informative because it lets you test whether motion was being used as a real separation creation tool, meaning motion, target, open window, positive EPA, or mostly as window dressing, motion, no target. The offense still lives in the same tight or middle window world. In Week 17, the Chargers threw only 4 total targets on plays classified as receiver motion. 1 target each to Will Dissly, Omarion Hampton, Trey Harris, and Oronde Gadsden II. Everyone else on your list, including the 3 perimeter names you care about most in this separation conversation, Quentin Johnston, Keenan Allen, and Ladd McConkey, had 0 targets on motion plays. That immediately matters for the play-calling constrained separation question, because it means the offense did not regularly use motion to manufacture a throw for its primary wide receiver volume, especially Johnston, who already showed low average separation on high volume, and Allen, who was even lower. When the Chargers did target motion, the throws were generally very open by separation, which is exactly what you would hope motion accomplishes. On those 4 motion targets, the average separation values were 9.7, Dissly, 6.2, Hampton, 4.1, Harris, and 2.8, Gadsden. That is a separation profile that strongly suggests motion was able to create clean throwing windows when it was actually used to generate a target. The results, however, were mixed because the sample is tiny. Trey Harris's 1 motion target produced plus 1.52 EPA per target. Hampton's was basically neutral, plus 0.01 EPA per target. Dissly's was negative minus 0.35 EPA per target, and Gadsden's target was very negative, minus 1.79 EPA per target, with a 0% catch rate on that 1 target. If you add the receiving expected points added together across the 4 motion targets, it comes out slightly negative overall. But that number is dominated by the single negative Gadsden play and is not stable enough to treat as a motion was bad conclusion. The bigger takeaway is about usage and distribution, not the tiny sample efficiency. You already showed that the Chargers' clearly open throws, 3 or more yards of separation, were concentrated in backs and tight ends, and that the tight window throws, less than 1 yard of separation, were rare. This motion split reinforces that same shape. When motion created large separation, the offense tended to feed backs and tight ends, and only one wide receiver target Harris. Meanwhile, the wide receivers with the highest relevance to your "why was Johnston not getting open" question were not the beneficiaries of motion-created targets. That pattern supports the idea that the Chargers were not consistently trying to manufacture easy, wide-open targets for their perimeter wide receiver volume, which is more of a play design and usage signal than a pure, the quarterback forced, tight throws signal. What this does not fully prove by itself is whether motion was unavailable or ineffective across the whole field. Your table shows that Johnston, Allen, and McConkey did run routes on motion plays. Their route counts appear in the motion table. But they were not targeted. That could mean the design used them as decoys, or that the quarterback chose different answers, or that Houston's coverage rules handled the motion without busting. To separate those possibilities cleanly, the single most useful companion table would be the Chargers' no motion receiving split for the same game, because then we can compare 1. Target share, 2. Average separation, and 3. EPA per target with motion versus without motion, and see whether motion actually increased open throws in a meaningful way or simply shifted them to backs and tight ends. If you paste the Week 17 Chargers receiving no motion split, same format, I can quantify the delta precisely and answer the question you're really driving at: whether motion was a missed lever for manufacturing separation for wide receivers, or whether motion was used but Houston's defense still prevented the motion equals open perimeter throw outcome.